and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Uncrowned King, Kongzi and the Analects. Some works of literature are so iconic, so firmly established as classics, that they seem to have been not so much written as discovered, as if they were dug up like buried treasure or fell from the sky. This feeling can be even stronger if we don't know much about the circumstances of their composition, or if the work seems hard to square with what we know about the life of the author. The Bhagavad Gita might be such an example, or Shakespeare's plays, which are so good that some people insist that he couldn't have written them. Within the Chinese tradition, the I Ching surely qualifies as such a text, as does the most central work of Confucianism. The Chinese title is Lunyu, meaning ordered sayings, but in English it usually goes by the name given to it by the European Jesuits, the Analects. It was not written by Kongzi himself, and does not pretend otherwise. He is throughout referred to in the third person, often simply as the master, with quite a few passages beginning with the phrase Zi Yue, meaning the master said. The opening of many passages in the Analects establish the authority of Kongzi as the founder of the tradition. They also lean on the figure of Kongzi to give weight to whatever he is meant to have said. It is the form of these conversations that is the source of the Confucius says jokes, with Kongzi saying many things he did and did not say. Yet for many readers, the Analects, the book, is all but identical with Kongzi, the man. It has become the canonical presentation of his thought, a work that makes the reader feel an intimate connection to its protagonist. It's also a book that's easy to pick up and enjoy, though far from easy to understand completely. Indeed, this is part of the appeal. As with the Gita or Hamlet, any encounter with this work both makes you feel that you've gotten a lot out of it and that there remains much more to discover. As Kongzi's student Zigong said, learning from his master was like drinking from the sea. Since the source was inexhaustible, he would simply take in as much as he could. Part of the reason the Analects eludes immediate comprehension is that, however timeless it may seem, it does often presuppose knowledge of the immediate historical context. At one point, Kongzi is appalled by a family shamelessly putting on an entertainment with 8 rows of dancers. To grasp why this would be scandalous, you have to know that it was customary for the emperor alone to have such a large troupe of dancers. Elsewhere, Kongzi says that his home state of Lu relates to the state of Wei as an elder to a younger brother, and we are again left to speculate about what this might mean. Still, many stories and sayings found in the Analects seem straightforward enough. You don't need a doctorate in Chinese history to understand a passage like, "The master said, a clever tongue and fine appearance are rarely signs of goodness." But this approachability is, by and large, misleading. The Analects is a text with its own complicated and elusive history. Far from falling complete from the sky, it was almost certainly composed in numerous stages, something that, by the way, also applies to the Bhagavad Gita. As with the Gita and many other ancient texts in India and China, the Analects has received attention from scholars who've attempted to tease apart different strata of the text. There's general agreement that the last 5 of the 20 books in the Analects are a later addition to the first 15. And even this putative original core is surely the work of more than one editor. As shown by other surviving works that offer reports about Kongzi, including recently excavated texts, the material in the Analects was gathered together from a much larger mass of stories and quotations of this famous sage. It's been estimated that less than 10% of the early material on Kongzi has parallels in the Analects. The version we are getting here is one that has been curated for use in educating young officials for public service, and thus it focuses on issues of moral character and leadership. As we'll see, other Kongzis were available. The status of the text as the canonical portrait of Kongzi goes back to the Western Han dynasty, to be specific, the reign of Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE. It is at this time that we get our first references to the title Lunyu. Under this emperor, a scholarly academy was set up for the study of classical literature, and the court library was expanded. This context helps explain the focus of the work on moral education. Of course, it would not have been helpful to this project to admit that the Analects is just a very partial selection of Confucian lore, so efforts were made to cement its status as a canonical, authentic text. Actually, cement is relevant in a more literal sense, In a move not too far from presenting the Analects as buried treasure, it was claimed that the text was discovered in the wall of Kongzi's own house. This, it was further alleged, is how the book survived the culling of literature that happened in the year 213 BCE under the Qin, when the centralization of books in the imperial libraries was accompanied by destruction of literature in private hands. Of course, this whole story is to be taken with extreme caution, since it transparently seeks to elevate the Han over the Qin by making them seem like the revivers of ancient wisdom their predecessors had tried to destroy. Emperor Wu is also credited with making the so-called Five Classics, Wu Jing, of Confucianism into textbooks and establishing positions for scholars who specialized in them. We already know something about this collection of canonical works, having discussed two of them in previous episodes, namely the Book of Changes, or I Ching, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. Remember that Kongzi supposedly wrote all of the annals and part of the I Ching. We also have on the list the Shi Jing, or Book of Odes, and you'll never guess who was traditionally credited with choosing the 305 poems included in the collection. Yes, Kongzi himself. It is highly praised in the Analects, which exhorts the reader, find inspiration in the odes, take your place through ritual, and achieve perfection with music. Speaking of which, there is also the Li Ji, or Book of Rites, which includes as one section a Book of Music. Unfortunately, an original 6th classic, devoted entirely to music, is lost. Finally, there is the Shu Jing, the Book of Documents, a collection of historical speeches and accounts featuring such characters as the great rulers Yao and Shun. Notice that 3 out of these 5 titles and the collective name for the whole set, 5 classics, include the word Jing, which, as we've already seen, refers to a classical canonical text. As that begins to suggest, these 5 classics form a core body of works on which the Confucian, or Ru, tradition could be based. But the canon continued to evolve. In the Eastern Han period, the Analects and another Confucian work, the Classic of Filial Piety, Xiao Jing, were added to the canon, and there were further expansions later, including the addition of the Mengzi in the Song dynasty. In this same period, Su Zi nominated 4 Confucian works, the Si Shu, as a set of texts to be studied before delving into the 5 classics. These 4 were the Great Learning, the Analects, the Mengzi, and the Doctrine of the Mean, all of which students needed to master in order to attempt the imperial examinations. So, the apparently serene and stable Confucian canon was in fact a work that was always in progress. Just as works could be added over time, so individual works like the I Ching and Analects were subject to highly contingent processes of editing and adding commentaries, which scholars sometimes call accretion. There's not really any overall system of organization detectable in the Analects, and more unsettlingly, there are sometimes apparent conflicts between bits of material that have been included. 2 widely separated passages in Books 3 and 11 seem to take contrary views on whether it could be appropriate to show histrionic grief. A number of entries discourage the search for fame and argue that it makes no difference if a worthy person goes unacknowledged for their virtue, yet at another point, Kongzi complains, "No one recognizes me." On the other hand, there are also plentiful signs of local organization in the text. Some books do seem like a chaotic mishmash, but others have a strong unifying principle. Book 10 focuses on ritual practice, and Book 19, which is already mentioned is probably one that was added later, presents sayings from Kongzi's disciples, some of which parallel texts earlier in the Analects. At an even more local level, there are passage clusters, which gather just a few quotations that belong together. For example, 4 consecutive texts in which Kongzi answers the question, "What is filial piety?" In what might seem a real editorial lapse, passages in different books occasionally duplicate one another. Ironically, one of the duplicated passages tries to convince us that the whole project of the Analects does cohere. Kongzi is made to say, twice, that his whole teaching can be strung on a single thread. And to be fair, this would be well worth repeating if it were true. Such remarks were an invitation to commentators to reconcile apparently conflicting material they found in the Analects. Here, it could actually help that Kongzi is consistently presented as being inconsistent, and deliberately so. One aspect of his unfathomable wisdom is that he tailors his advice to his audience, so that he may give different answers to the same question, depending on who is asking. A noteworthy example is Kongzi's identification of that single thread that runs through his whole philosophy. When his student, Zhu Gong, asks for just one word to guide him through life, Kongzi answers, mutuality, or shu. There's some variation in the translation of the word shu. Mutuality would express a complementary arrangement and reciprocal understanding. Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont translate it as putting oneself in the other's place, while Edward Slingerland translates it as understanding. These various translations bear out shu's relational quality. For Slingerland, this passage seems to conflict with an earlier passage that couples understanding with dutifulness. Slingerland speculates that, in addition to offering Zigong just one word as requested, Kongzi may be adjusting the advice to his students' strengths and weaknesses. He's already dutiful, but needs to grow in understanding. It's tempting to take a similar approach to the aforementioned sequence in which Kongzi gives alternate definitions of filial piety to different people. In a still more striking passage, he gently chastises his bold disciple Zilu, who asks Kongzi whom he would want at his side if riding into battle. Zilu is obviously hoping to hear that he would be the master's first choice, but instead, Kongzi says, "I wouldn't want someone who would attack a tiger barehanded or attempt to swim the Yellow River because he does not fear death." Good point. But surely if Kongzi had been speaking to an interlocutor who was too timid instead of too reckless, he would have made the opposite point. This passage also illustrates another general feature of the text, namely that Kongzi freely directs criticism at his students and other people. He is quick to lament lapses in ritual propriety, li, as with that family who had too many dancers. One passage combines both of these strategies. He is confronted with Zaiwo, who thinks it is enough to mourn his parents for only 1 year instead of a more appropriate 3 years. Kongzi basically says, well, if you feel that 1 year is enough, then by all means go ahead. When Zaiwo leaves, Kongzi turns to his disciples and says this just shows how lacking in goodness the man is. The critical tone is obvious. Less obvious is the pastoral dimension, but it's there nonetheless. Kongzi evidently thinks there is no hope of getting Zaiwo to show filial piety as he should. Even if he kept up a show of grief, it would be hypocritical. But the exchange has offered him a chance to educate the others who are present, and they may benefit from the lesson. Now, here's another unsettling thought. What if the Analects teaches us the way that Kongzi teaches his disciples? In that case, it might withhold teachings from us until we are ready. The master is quoted as saying, "I will not open the door for a mind that is not already striving to understand, nor will I provide words to a tongue that is not already struggling to speak. If I hold up one corner of a problem and the student cannot come back to me with the other 3, I will not attempt to instruct him again." All of which fits with the impression we mentioned at the outset, that this is a text that rewards repeated rereadings. As the reader grows in insight and invests more effort to understand, they will get more out of it. This, of course, means that different people are likely to take different lessons from the work, which is in fact exactly what happened. An interesting study by Philip Ivanhoe looks at a single sentence from the Analects and how it was given very different readings throughout Chinese history. As it happens, the passage concerns precisely the question of what Kongzi was and was not willing or able to teach. Let's let Karen tell us how it reads in Chinese.
子贡曰：夫子之文章，可得而闻也；夫子之言，信与天道，不可得而闻也。
Slingerland's English version of this goes as follows. Zigong said, "The master's cultural brilliance is something that is readily heard about, whereas one does not get to hear the master expounding on the subjects of human nature or the way of heaven." As Ivanhoe shows, commentators with Taoist leanings adopted a rather mystical reading of the passage, taking it to mean that Tao is not susceptible to intellectual explanation. Other interpreters took almost the reverse lesson from it, namely that Kongzi, unlike the Taoists, was simply not in the business of delving into such metaphysical matters, but focused on cultural behavior like ritual and proper ethics. The same sort of problem arises with another entry, which reads, "Standing on the bank of a river, the master said, 'Look at how it flows on like this, never stopping day or night.'" Fans of Greek philosophy might be reminded of Heraclitus and the idea that you can't step into the same river twice, symbolizing the fact that all things are constantly changing and flowing. The resonance might not be misleading, given that, as we know, the concept of change was also fundamental to early Chinese thought. A Taoist might well take Kongzi to be making an observation along these lines, but more Confucian readings, so to speak, were also offered. For example, that the river symbolizes the constant progress of the learner towards virtue, or even that this is a lament in which Kongzi reflects at how time has been passing without bringing success to his campaign to rectify his own society. That reading may seem a bit of a stretch, but it's no surprise that it leapt to an interpreter's mind. As we already mentioned in episode 4, Kongzi's potential as an advisor was mostly overlooked by the rulers of his own time. Both metaphorically and literally, he spent a good deal of time in the political wilderness. So, Confucians were sensitive to the accusation that the master had failed in his mission. Numerous texts in the Analects and beyond reflect this concern. Kongzi himself is credited with a range of frustrated remarks, like, "Do you take me to be a bitter gourd, content to hang on a string without ever being eaten?" Supposedly, a contemporary named Jie Yu told him he was being foolish to try to teach virtue in wicked times. When the world has the way, the sage succeeds. When the world is without the way, the sage looks to survival. Later thinkers of rival philosophical persuasions sometimes used Kongzi's reported political failings against him. He was accused of breaking his moral principles under duress and compared unfavorably to the more effective Mozi. The legalist thinker Han Fei, meanwhile, had a more philosophically principled complaint. He admitted that Kongzi was a great sage, but thought it was foolish to base the fortunes of a whole society on the presence of such a man, since sages come along so rarely. Han Fei compared this to a foolish peasant who saw a rabbit run into a tree stump and bash its brains out, and thenceforth spent all his time watching the tree stump, hoping for more rabbits to do the same so he'd have something to eat for dinner. Confucians, of course, tried to clear their founding master of all blame. For them, Kongzi was the uncrowned king, whose attempts to exert influence failed simply because the rulers of the time were venal and corrupt. One of the sayings that comes up twice in the Analects is, "I have yet to meet a man who loves virtue as much as he loves female beauty." Supposedly, this remark was made in the context of deploring the debauchery of the rulers of the state of Lu, which incited him to leave court. That, at least, is the background supplied by one of the most important texts about Kongzi, apart from the Analects itself, a biography of the master included in a work called Shi Ji, or Record of the Historian. Its author was Sima Tian, whom we met in episode 4 as a figure responsible for organizing Warring States philosophy into a certain number of identified schools. He worked around 100 BCE, just as the Analects was getting its canonical status. Sima Tian aspired to be the successor of Kongzi, a fellow moralizing historian, given that Kongzi was believed to be the author of the Spring and Autumn Annals. So Sima Tian finished his biography by quoting the odes, "High is the mountain I look up to." The set of 5 classics was also used to excuse Kongzi for his apparent ineffectiveness in the face of political turmoil. When the going gets tough, the tough retreat to their study and collect poetry and information about rituals and history. Sima Tian thus says that when the state of Lu fell into disorder, Kongzi did not take office, but retired and tended to the odes, documents, rites, and music. We get a lot of information, or at least putative information, about Kongzi from Sima Tian, some of which is not so easy to square with the Analects. That text presents us with an unfailingly wise sage helping others to progress in virtue, who looks back on his own life and says that he set his mind upon learning at the age of 15 and understood the mandate of heaven when he was 50. Sima Tian's Kongzi is shown working his way towards this mature wisdom. As a young man, he is arrogant and judgmental, and only as he ages does he acquire the humility found in sayings of the Analects like, "When walking with 2 other people, I will always find a teacher among them." Elsewhere in the text, Kongzi modestly admits that he has not been able to achieve the Tao of the righteous man, which would mean being free of worry, confusion, and fear. But immediately, one of his star pupils, Zigong, jumps in to say that Kongzi was after all a fine example of such righteousness. In contrast, the Records gives us a Kongzi who is subject to justifiable criticism and includes scenes where that criticism comes from his students, as when the same disciple, Zigong, blames him for breaking an oath. Sima Tian is also one of the sources to recount the too good to be true meeting between the great sages Kongzi and Laozi, who reminded Kongzi of a dragon. Presumably, this is a compliment. According to Sima Tian, Laozi told Kongzi to beware of giving frank advice to rulers, advice that was itself ignored by the ambitious Kongzi. This scene too can be put into the file of evidence about Kongzi's political failings and their cause. Despite these divergences and differences in tone between the Analects and the Records of Sima Tian, the Kongzi of both texts is recognizably the same character. If we cast a wider net, though, we'll catch versions of the man that are very different indeed. As his legend grew, he grew more legendary, with magical abilities like supernatural strength, intelligence, and speed. In material that circulated in the Han period, he's described as performing successful divination, identifying mysterious animals and objects, and being the issue of a union between his mother and a dark spirit who appeared to her in a dream, leaving her to wake up pregnant. Then there's his physical appearance. Sima Qian told us that he was born with a protuberance in his forehead, accounting for his endearing childhood nickname, Middle Sun Hillock. The same text recounts how he was said to look like a homeless dog, which made Kongzi say with a chuckle that he could only agree. By contrast, more fabulous descriptions of the man say that he looked like a squatting dragon when he sat, and like a driven ox when he stood. From a distance, he looked like the Big Dipper. Again, this is presumably a compliment. How then are we to find the genuine Kongzi amidst all of this conflicting evidence? In all honesty, the answer is that we can't. The best we can hope is that the Analects and other materials circulating in the Han period at least go back to the time of Kongzi himself, or are based on orally transmitted testimonies about him. A spirited argument to this effect has been made by Paul Golden, who emphasizes that philological arguments about texts and their transmission need to be augmented by considering the philosophical ideas found in those texts. He finds it significant that later philosophical concepts and concerns, like yin-yang theory and the cultivation of bodily welfare, espoused by the somewhat later thinker Yang Tzu, are absent from the Analects. This is, of course, an argument from silence, but it might still help convince us that even if the Analects as we have it was collected several hundred years after Kongzi died, the sayings and stories that were taken into the collection might go back to a far earlier time period. On a lighter note, it's been proposed that we may most hear the genuine voice of Kongzi when he makes us laugh. Christoph Hobsmeyer pointed out that many passages of the Analects are funny, and even better, supposed to be funny. And he's not wrong. At one point, Kongzi even explicitly says one of his comments was not to be taken seriously, and quite a few of the passages could get a laugh from the modern reader. Here's one. Kongzi hears that a villager has been speaking badly of him on the grounds that he has failed to distinguish himself in any field. He turns to his students and says, "What art then should I take up? Charioteering? Archery? I think I'll take up charioteering." While it would probably be too reductive to take this as merely a joke, it does seem to be a joke. Beyond the Analects, too, there is genuinely amusing material in which Kongzi matches wits with other sages. In one story, he is again pitted against Lao Tzu, who asks him what he is reading. Kongzi, teasing Lao Tzu for his lack of interest in traditional decorum, says it is a book about ritual and adds, "Even a sage will read such a book." Lao Tzu shoots back, "Fine, but why are you reading it?" Philosophy is serious business, of course, and we may be especially unprepared to find humor in such an ancient and celebrated a philosophical text as the Analects, but it's tempting to wonder whether Hobsmeyer is right in his rather ironic judgment that the more un-Confucian and unsagely the humorous passages we discover in the Analects are, the more likely they are to be faithful to the man and his personal history, and the more likely we are to hear the master's voice. As it may, no one can reasonably doubt that there are deep and rewarding ethical teachings in the Analects and the other texts that have communicated the ideas of Kongzi to us across the ages. We're going to need a number of episodes to explore them, starting with some of the main ideas in the Analects, including ren, or benevolence, li, or ritual propriety, and the idea of moral leadership. So, it's no laughing matter when we tell you to join us for that next time here on The History of Philosophy in China.